The final whistle blew. Spain were world champions, and for a brief moment, it looked like football had delivered exactly the kind of ending tournament organizers dream about. The confetti fell, the cameras caught tears, the trophy was polished under the lights, and the winning players disappeared beneath a wall of noise, color, and celebration. But then the mood shifted, not all at once, not with one explosive headline or one dramatic announcement. It changed in that quieter, more dangerous way public opinion often does. When people stop celebrating the ending they were given and start replaying the path that led to it, because as the night moved on, the story stopped being only about Spain's victory, it became about the reaction to it. And very quickly, that reaction stopped focusing only on the players and started turning toward FIFA. That is what makes this moment so interesting. Spain winning the World Cup should have been the headline that swallowed everything else. A disciplined team, a tense final, a famous trophy lifted under the biggest lights the sport can offer. Normally, that kind of ending closes the conversation, freezes the legacy in place before doubts can gather any real momentum. But this time, the opposite happened. The longer people sat with what they had watched, the more the conversation widened. The goal mattered. The result mattered. But what began to matter even more was the atmosphere around the match, the handling of key moments, the images that followed the final whistle, and the sense that football's most powerful institution was once again finding itself too close to a spectacle that people did not fully trust. And that is the word that started hanging over everything: trust. Not because everyone believed the same theory, and not because one piece of proof had suddenly changed the official result, but because this was one of those nights where too many separate questions arrived at the same time. Questions about tone, questions about standards, questions about control, questions about whether the final had been allowed to breathe like a football match, or whether it had become trapped inside something bigger, a machine of presentation, politics, pressure, and image management that FIFA has spent years trying to perfect. Spain's win may have been real on the scoreboard, but the reaction to that win exposed a deeper discomfort. People were not only arguing over what happened, they were arguing over whether the sport's governing body still inspires the confidence it expects from the world every time it sells a grand conclusion. That backslash did not come from one place. It came from everywhere at once. Came from pundits who focused on the match and still sounded uneasy by the end of their analysis. It came from neutral viewers who felt that the night looked too chaotic in some moments and too carefully managed in others. It came from former players who praised Spain's quality but could not fully shake the feeling that the final itself had left behind a residue. It came from journalists who were meant to be writing about triumph and instead found themselves writing about scenes, controversy, symbolism, and governance. And perhaps most damaging of all for FIFA, it came from the growing realization that this backlash was not really about one call, one foul, or one opinion. It was about accumulation, one awkward image after another, one doubtful conversation after another, one reminder after another that football's biggest stage still struggles to escape the shadow of its own reputation, because reputation matters more in moments like this than FIFA would ever like to admit. If another sports organization presided over a strange final, it might be able to sell the public a simple line and move on. But FIFA does not operate in that luxury. FIFA carries history into every tournament. History of suspicion, history of politics, history of scandals that taught people to look twice whenever the picture seems too clean or the messaging seems too polished. That does not mean every controversial night proves corruption. It does not mean every backlash is fair. But it does mean FIFA no longer receives the benefit of innocence from many fans. The moment something feels off, the institution becomes part of the story. And once the institution becomes part of the story, the match is no longer just a match. It becomes a test of credibilities. Spain's actual performance only made that tension more complicated. On one level, they looked like worthy champions. They were organized, intelligent, emotionally controlled, tactically strong enough to turn pressure into patience. There were long stretches where they seemed to know exactly what the night required. They did not chase panic. They did not let the game completely slip into disorder. They kept finding ways to restore structure when everything around them threatened to become frantic. In another final, that composure might have become the entire legend. In another final, story might have been written as a masterpiece of discipline defeating desperation. But this was not that kind of ending. This was the kind of ending where excellence and discomfort existed side by side, and where every moment of praise for Spain seemed to trigger another question about the stage on which that praise was being delivered. That is where FIFA's backlash really began to gather force. Because once a tournament reaches its final act, the sport is no longer judged only by the football itself. It is judged by the experience it creates around the football, how the pressure is handled, how the narrative is shaped, how authority appears on the screen, how chaos is contained or not contained, how moments of controversy are allowed to settle or are instantly buried beneath larger imagery. On this night, many people felt that the final never fully belonged to the players. It felt like it kept drifting in and out of football and performance, in and out of competition and production, in and out of genuine sporting drama and the kind of overmanaged spectacle that modern FIFA events increasingly attract criticism for. That criticism was already there beneath the surface. Spain's win just gave it a new flashpoint. Then came the scenes after the whistle, and with them came the most visible symbol of why this backlash grew so quickly. Instead of a clean emotional release, the closing images of the final were dragged into confrontation, ugliness, tension, and a sense that the world's biggest football match had not ended with dignity so much as rupture. These moments were replayed everywhere. Panels discussed them. Clips spread faster than analysis, and every replay did the same thing to FIFA's image. It pulled the organization away from celebration and back into scrutiny, because when your biggest event ends in chaos, people do not only ask what the losing players did wrong, they ask what kind of atmosphere had been building all night. They ask whether the event was being controlled properly. They ask whether the game had been allowed to slide towards something preventable. And they ask why football's governing body always seems to find itself chasing optics after promising order. That is the trap FIFA keeps walking into. It wants to own the grandeur of football's biggest moments, but when the mood breaks, it cannot detach itself from the fallout. It wants the camera to worship the ceremony, but the camera also captures everything else. The frustration, the body language, the security response, the post-match confusion, the awkward pauses, the uneasy faces. On nights like this, spectacle becomes a double-edged sword. The more heavily an event is packaged as a perfect global product, the more fragile it looks the moment reality cuts across the script. And Spain's win, for all its quality, ended inside exactly that kind of fracture. The official story was triumph. The emotional story was messier, and it is always the messier story that fuels backlash. Then there was the broader visual theater surrounding the trophy ceremony itself, sequence that should have sealed the night in gold and instead gave critics even more to talk about. Instead of the match's human ending, belonging entirely to the players, the ceremony became wrapped in images that made the event feel political, staged, strangely distant from the purity FIFA always claims to defend. For some viewers, it was not one single visual that caused the discomfort. It was the cumulative effect of everything, the heavy symbolism, the public positioning, the sense that football's crowning moment was once again being asked to carry too many non-football meanings at once. That is a serious problem for FIFA, because when the image of victory becomes controversial, the institution behind the image absorbs the damage whether it wants to or not. And by then, the criticism was no longer limited to match incidents. It had expanded into a larger conversation about FIFA's relationship with the modern game. Has the organization become too invested in event management and global branding? Has it confused grandeur with control? Has it built tournaments that are visually larger, commercially louder, and politically heavier, while becoming more vulnerable to exactly the kind of distrust it claims to be leaving behind? These are not new questions. That is why this backlash matters. It was not born from nowhere. It plugged directly into years of existing skepticism. The organization did not face new criticism because Spain won. It faced new criticism because Spain won on a night that reopened old wounds people were already carrying into the tournament. The uncomfortable truth for FIFA is that backlash becomes much harder to contain when it aligns with memory. Fans remember previous controversies. They remember corruption headlines. They remember bidding scandals. They remember the feeling that football's biggest authority too often behaves like a body that wants complete power without complete accountability. So, when a final produces confusion, conflict, and awkward symbolism all at once, the public does not interpret those moments in isolation. It connects them. It layers the new doubts over the old ones. That is why even neutral observers who did not come into the match looking for scandal found themselves asking questions afterward. Not because they had proof of something sinister, but because FIFA has spent too many years teaching the world that doubt is a rational instinct around its biggest productions. For Spain, that creates a difficult and unfair dynamic at the same time. They may have done enough on the pitch to deserve the title. They may have executed their plan better, held their nerve longer, and ultimately found the winning moment that defines champions. But when an organization surrounding the victory attracts more attention than it should, even legitimate triumphs can become emotionally complicated. That is the cruelty of backlash. It does not always attack the result directly. Sometimes it attacks the environment around the result until the result itself starts to feel less secure in public memory. Spain lifted the trophy, but FIFA's baggage climbed onto the stage with them. And once that happens, even brilliant football has to compete with suspicion. That suspicion only deepened because so many analysts were careful in the way they framed their criticism. They were not all saying the same thing, but they were circling around the same discomfort. Some talked about the officiating climate of the final. Some talked about the emotional volatility. Some focused on the post-match scenes. Others focused on the broader presentation of the event and how quickly the football itself seemed to disappear beneath symbolism and spectacle. What linked all these reactions together was their tone. This was not the wild certainty of conspiracy culture. It was something more credible and more damaging, professional unease. The kind that says, we may not all agree on the precise cause, but we can all feel the same problem. And that kind of reaction is dangerous for FIFA because it is harder to dismiss than outrage from one side. Outrage can be labeled bitterness. Fan anger can be reduced to tribalism. A defeated nation can be portrayed as emotional. But widespread unease from multiple corners of the football world is something else. It suggests that the issue is not only who won and who lost. It suggests the issue is whether the institution presiding over the night has once again failed the test of confidence. The moment that question becomes mainstream, FIFA loses control of the frame. It no longer gets to tell the public the final was glorious and move on. It now has to live with a second narrative growing beside the first, one in which Spain's win becomes the trigger for renewed doubts about the body that staged it. There is also a deeper irony at work here. FIFA spends enormous energy presenting the World Cup as football's purest expression, the place where the sport rises above club rivalries, money, and politics to become something almost sacred. But the more aggressively it markets that purity, the more exposed it becomes whenever reality looks compromised, clumsy, or overly manufactured. If you promise people the sport's most honest stage, then every dishonest-looking image becomes magnified. Every awkward moment becomes symbolic. Every backlash feels like moral failure rather than ordinary criticism. That is exactly what happened after Spain's win. The problem was not only that people objected. The problem was that their objections felt like they belonged inside a much larger story about what FIFA says football is versus what football often looks like under FIFA's watch. And once that larger story returns, it drags everything with it. Old documentaries, old allegations, old examples of governance failure, old clips of officials promising reform, old reminders that the institution has spent years trying to rebuild trust it once shattered so completely. This is why backlash after a final is never just about a final. A World Cup ending is a mirror. It reflects the health of the sport's image back to the world in one concentrated burst. If the reflection looks noble, FIFA benefits. If the reflection looks distorted, FIFA pays the price. On this occasion, too many viewers looked into that mirror and saw a sport still struggling to separate glory from theater, triumph from politics, and football from the institutional noise wrapped around it. By the next day, the result was still official. Spain were still champions, but the public energy had already drifted somewhere else. It drifted toward the reactions, toward the clashes, toward the footage people could not stop replaying, toward the uncomfortable symbolism of the ceremony, toward the wider question of whether FIFA knows how to stage the modern game without inflaming all the distrust it claims to have outgrown. That is why the backlash feels new, even though the themes are old. The names change. The tournament changes, the champions change, but the institution keeps finding itself in the same emotional neighborhood. One where the story after the match becomes less about footballing excellence and more about whether football's rulers have once again mishandled the moment they were supposed to protect. And perhaps that is the most telling part of all. Nobody needed to erase Spain's achievement for FIFA to suffer damage. Nobody needed to prove some grand hidden plot. All it took was a final that left too many people restless and too many images open to interpretation. All it took was one more night where the organization's authority looked less reassuring than intrusive. One more night where the cameras captured not only celebration but complication. One more night where the conversation fans wanted to have about football was hijacked by the conversation they keep having about FIFA. Institutions lose trust in increments, not always through catastrophe, but through repetition. Through the exhausting familiarity, sees the same doubts rise every time the stakes are highest. That is why this backlash may matter more than FIFA would like, because it reminds the world that image control is not the same thing as legitimacy. Trophy ceremony can be polished, a final can be branded, a narrative can be pushed. But if the emotional memory of the event hardens around discomfort, then the institution loses the deeper battle. And emotional memory is powerful in football. It determines which victories feel immortal, which feel disputed, and which are remembered with an invisible asterisk, even when no official mark is ever placed beside them. Spain may escape this as champions. They probably will. FIFA is less likely to escape as cleanly, because what happened after Spain's win did not just create argument, it reactivated mistrust. So now the real question is not whether Spain deserved to win. That debate will continue, but it is not the heart of this story. The real question is why their victory became the setting for such an immediate and expanding backlash against the institution that staged it. Why did this final, more than so many others, feel like it was carrying too much baggage into its own ending? Why did the post-match images feel less like closure and more like ignition? Why did the world's biggest football organization once again leave people talking less about the beauty of the game and more about the discomfort surrounding its presentation? FIFA will try to move forward, as it always does. It will point to the spectacle, the audiences, the success, the champions, the numbers. But numbers do not settle mood. Spectacle does not erase unease. And the unease after this final was real. In the end, that may be the defining legacy of the night. Spain won the World Cup, but FIFA inherited the backlash, not because one event alone condemned it, but because one event was enough to awaken everything the organization hoped had gone quiet. And once those old questions wake up, they rarely go back to sleep quickly. They spread through highlight packages, post-match analysis, panel debates, social clips, and every future discussion about how football's grandest stage is really being run. That is the danger of what happened after Spain's win. It did not just produce criticism, it produced momentum. And momentum, once it starts moving against FIFA, has a way of turning a single awkward night into the beginning of a much bigger problem.